Our webinar today is entitled Following Jesus During Challenging Times. I'm your host, Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz. I'm the denominational minister for Peace and Justice for Mennonite Church USA. I want to let you know we have Spanish translation available. And if you go to the bottom of your screen to the bar, there should be a More button. And if you click that, there will be a little world that says interpretation for Spanish translation. So please feel free to do that. I want to start by saying that I'm joined by a number of people today, and the first is Iris De Leon Hartshorn. She's the Associate Executive Director of Operations and Director of Human Resources for Mennonite Church USA. Rachel Ringenberg Miller is our denominational minister for ministerial leadership for Mennonite Church USA. Isaac Villegas is a member of Chapel Hill Mennonite Fellowship, and he's the author of the forthcoming book, Migrant God, A Christian Vision for Immigrant Justice, which can be ordered through the link in the chat. I'm personally looking forward to my signed copy for that plug. You're welcome, Isaac. We also have Joel Miller, lead pastor at Columbus Mennonite Church and president-elect for the board of directors of Central District Conference. We also have two additional guests. Kelsey and Rupa are from ICAP, the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, and Iris will introduce them further once we've heard from Isaac, Rachel, and Joel. I also want to let you know that tonight's gathering, or today's gathering, depending on where you are, is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat. We have received an overwhelming number of registrations and pre-submitted questions for this webinar. We so appreciate your participation and your questions. Many of the questions that have been asked will be answered during the presentation by our panelists, but due to the high volume, we will also be selecting questions that the panelists can answer in the time available, and ones that we feel like will benefit the most participants, ones that are questions that have been asked more than once. And thank you for your understanding of that. But you also have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And only the panelists will be able to see your questions, but please feel free if something comes up for you to use that. And we'll, again, depending on time, be opening that. I want to take a moment to open us in prayer. Please join me. Loving God, we come before you today, seeking wisdom, strength, and compassion as we gather for this significant conversation on immigration and the role of the church. You are the God who has called us to welcome the stranger and the sojourner, the one who calls us to welcome the weary, protect the vulnerable, and to stand for justice. May our time together be a space of learning, reflection, and action. Guide our hearts to listen with empathy, our minds to discern truth, and our hands to do the work of justice and mercy. We pray for all those impacted by the decisions being made, especially those who journey in search of safety and opportunity. Be near to those who live in fear, comfort those who feel alone, and help us provide for those in need. May our churches be living testaments of your love, standing boldly in faith. Inspire us with courage and conviction to be faithful to your call. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we are going to start our time together by hearing stories and experiences, first from Isaac, and then Rachel, and then Joel. So I'll turn it over to you, Isaac.
Thanks, Lorraine. Good to be here with you all. I've been asked to share a bit about our congregation's experience of sanctuary, offering sanctuary to Rosa del Carmen. During the first Trump administration, she lived at church for 2 years, from 2018 to 2020. I have 3 points, maybe four, let's say 4 points, just so it's not cliche, just doing 3 points. So 4 points. First, I'm going to talk about how our congregation's location in the immigrant justice ecosystem in our area, what it was, and then 2, how our location led to our offering of sanctuary to somebody who is undocumented, and then 3, how our network of congregations and people and organizations help sustain Rosa and our congregation during congregation. Oh, and 4, a little bit about ICE verification and ICE watching, which is becoming more and more important. All right, so the first point, our church's location in the immigrant justice ecosystem. So our congregation, people from our church, participate in all sorts of immigrant solidarity work before the first Trump administration. It's not like Trump invented kind of the anti-immigrant posture of our country. There's a history to it. And so our congregation was involved in, I don't know, let's see, ICE protests, for example. We found a ICE detention center that was hidden in a strip mall, basically, and we exposed them to the public, called the news. We would do every year, we would have a foot washing service on Holy Thursday and demand to wash the feet of our immigrant brothers and sisters that were kept inside. Our congregation worked with Church World Service, which is an organization that helps care for immigrants with or without papers in our community. And then we were involved with the North Carolina Council of Churches, which had, at the time, a robust farm workers program. A lot of farm workers were undocumented people. So through those organizational connections and through activism, our congregation already was part of a larger immigrant justice movement in our community. And so 2, that location led us to sanctuary, to this offer of sanctuary. So in November of 2016, when Trump was elected, there was already organizing, conversations, and planning that was already in motion that we and I was a part of in our community, so that when somebody made a request for sanctuary, for the protection of church sanctuary, we heard about that and we discerned what we wanted to do if sanctuary is something we could commit to. So that involved our own congregational discernment. We rented our space. Church rented our space from another congregation, so that we had to convince them that this was a good idea. Worked out a covenant with that congregation of what it would mean. And once we made our decision and remodeled an office into a living space and all sorts of reconfiguration of church property, we let organizers know, and that were friends in our community, that we were ready to accept somebody into protective church sanctuary. And Rosa was the second person who contacted us. The first person contacted us, we started working with them, and they decided that sanctuary was not something they could commit to. I mean, it's an intense thing to do, to live just on church property. And so Rosa was the second person who contacted us, and we received her into sanctuary. When we did so, it was part of our public witness. Things are definitely look like they're changing this time in this Trump administration, but in the previous one, we felt moderately confident that ICE would continue to abide by their sensitive location policy to not trespass onto church property. And we also thought that the more publicity that we had would keep Rosa safer. So we let the news know, we let our local sheriff, we wrote letters to the local sheriff, the police chief, the ICE field officer. We let ICE know that we were, someone was living on church property. We let our congressional representative know. So this was like a part of a larger project of saying, look, this is our witness. This is what it means to be Christians. This is who we are. And then, so the third point, the intercongregational network that developed to sustain Rosa and our congregation. So, it took a lot of work to provide, to care for Rosa, groceries, someone to buy groceries for her, someone to do we had no laundry facility, so we had to, someone had to take turns to do her laundry, provide medical care when that arose, to pay and find somebody to come to church to tend to her. Overnight accompaniment for her own safety. She asked for people to stay overnight. Churches can be scary at night if you're all alone. So it took teams of people. So we had 11 congregations in our area all join us, and 160 volunteers. That's what it took to care for her. And then lastly, my fourth point is that through this work of providing sanctuary for Rosa in North Carolina at the time, we had 6 people in sanctuary in different churches throughout the state, developed into a network through the Council of Churches, supporting one another, and the American Friends Service Committee. And that kind of birthed this another aspect of our sanctuary witness, which American Friends Service Committee called Sanctuary Everywhere. So this is not just about people who could be in churches, but this is for communities beyond our churches. And Sanctuary Everywhere got us involved in what is called ICE Watch or ICE verification, at least some of us. And what that means is we discovered that ICE extends their power in our communities through fear. So yes, when they do show up, it's very scary, but then rumors of them showing up is very scary. And so people would not send their kids to school if they heard that ICE would be in the neighborhood. People wouldn't go to work. And so there were teams of ICE verification. So if there was a rumor, you could call a hotline to say, hey, you know what? I think there's ICE agents at the local Hardee's. Can someone go check it out? And so teams of trained volunteers would go and confront those people and say, are you ICE? If they don't answer your question, they probably are ICE, is what I discovered. And also just be like, no, they're just police, let's say, or someone in a van that looks like an ICE van, but not an ICE van. And then you can reassure folks that ICE was not in the neighborhood. So that's become more significant during this already in this new Trump administration. Here in our community in North Carolina, in Durham, the week of Trump's all of those executive orders, there were people who were impersonating ICE officers and showing up to Latino grocery stores and demanding to see people's papers. And they had ICE, they, dressed up in costumes as if they were ICE and had decals on their vehicles that said Department of Homeland Security. I just saw that so far in 3 different states, people have been arrested for impersonating ICE officers. So ICE verification is an important way that you can extend sanctuary everywhere. Local organization here in North Carolina is called Siembra. It's immigrant-led, and they help organize ICE watching patrols so that people can be reassured that ICE is not there, or that ICE is there and they should probably stay at home. So those are the four things I wanted to share about how, for us in our congregation, sanctuary, offering sanctuary to Rosa was part of a larger story of our involvement in immigrant justice in our community over a long period of time. 2, that led us to someone to ask us for sanctuary, and we were prepared for that. 3, it takes a lot of people to do this work. I mean, it took 11 congregations, 160 volunteers to provide care for Rosa. And 4, this witness of sanctuary is not just for the church, hopefully, but for the rest of the community. So it's important to get involved in what immigrant-led organizations are doing in our communities. Those are the things I wanted to share. Thank you all for listening, and I will pass it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Isaac. Yeah, it's really good to be here with you all. I'm going to tell the story of how Shalom Mennonite Church in Newton, Kansas, a congregation I pastored, came to the decision to be a place to host sanctuary. And I think context is important. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Shalom congregation as it was at the time. So the Shalom congregation is a primarily white congregation. Many of the folks in this congregation can trace their history back to the Russian Mennonites, who came to the United States in the 1870s, 1880s, looking for safety, looking for a place to practice their faith, to build community, and also seeking economic opportunity. Newton in Kansas itself is a very rural town and state. Newton is about a 30-minute drive from the largest city, which is Wichita, which is about 400,000 people. Newton itself, combining with North Newton, is around 20,000 people. So it's a pretty small community and town. But in this area of Newton and North Newton, there are 5 Mennonite churches in this community, and Shalom was one of them. When I came to Shalom in 2015, the congregation was discerning how they wanted to engage with their community beyond themselves. So that's really where they were when I arrived. They're wanting to know how can they spread God's love in their community. And so they spent some time discerning that before I arrived. And eventually came up with this mission statement called Following Jesus, We Risk Love, as a way to say, this is who we are. We're following Jesus, and we will make choices based upon our faith and what it means to follow Jesus. And so we started having conversations. I think you're going to hear a theme between the 3 of us in terms of congregational discernment and kind of finding ourselves in this path. So in 2016, we had a series of conversations on how we were going to discern as a community, how we were going to be involved in our community. And during that time, Trump was elected for the first time. And so that really moved us into the focus of immigration, paying attention to who is in our community, what we were hearing in our community, and how we could support those in our community. And we decided that we had the gifts and skills that were needed to build relationships with recent immigrants in the Newton and North Newton area. So that was really our goal in the beginning, was to go beyond ourselves, to build relationships, to build community. We felt like this was where God was calling us, so we wanted to learn more, and we wanted to figure out who should we be connected with. So this is how we started to build relationships. We attended worship service and events with a congregation with various mixed immigration status. We hosted a community forum with the mayor, city council members, and the county sheriff to learn how immigrant enforcement was going to happen in our community, because every community decides a little bit differently. So we wanted to hear exactly from our law enforcement and our government officials what they meant. And then I myself built a relationship with the executive director of an immigrant justice organization. And so this really kind of pushed us towards moving to a place to offer sanctuary, because that was not our goal. Our goal was to build relationships. And in the conversation with this immigrant justice group, the executive director finally pulled me aside one day and was like, Rachel, we need some church in Kansas to be a place of sanctuary. There are no sanctuary churches in Kansas. We need somebody to do it. Will Shalom do it? And so that's how we ended up making that decision. Again, we had congregational meetings with ourselves, with the executive director of this organization, and with an immigration attorney. We spent a lot of time discerning that. And then eventually we decided that, yes, this is what we are going to do. The result of this decision, though, for us did not end up hosting anyone in sanctuary. We had 2 calls, 2 people who thought about it. But as Isaac said, this is nobody's first choice. It is like the dead last choice for everybody. And they found other options that worked better for them. But we did do other things. We did form a ministry where a group of us women from Shalom and from other Mennonite communities went to the prisons where women were detained by ICE and met with them, prayed with them, offered resources, and just spent time with them before they were deported, because everyone was. We also joined a refugee resettlement organization and helped with that. And so we did a variety of things. Each step kind of moved us to making different choices. And that's how we ended up saying, all right, this is who we are. This is who God called us to be. And discernment is so, so very important. You need to spend a lot of time in discussion with one another, determining how is God calling you in this particular time? Is it sanctuary or is it something else? Not everyone should do sanctuary. There are other roles and other things that are needed. So I'm going to share a slide of questions that might be helpful as your congregation maybe discerns what's next for them or what sanctuary might be or what they might do to support folks in their community. So here are some questions to start with. What does it look like to love God and your neighbor as yourself in your community? As I said, not all communities need the same thing. It could be sanctuary, it could be something else. The second question, what are the gifts and skills of your congregation and how do they match the gifts or the needs in your community? So take time to think about that and discern together. And I shared this verse from Matthew 22. To me, this is just a guiding verse, a guiding principle on how I figure out how God is calling me, how am I to live? And this is from the Common English Bible, the Anabaptist Community Bible translation. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You must love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. So I offer these questions to you as you discern what makes sense for your community and how God is calling you. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Joel.
Thanks, Rachel. Our congregation provided sanctuary during the first Trump administration for 3 years and 4 months. Edith Espinal lived with us. And we are also preparing to welcome someone into sanctuary next week. So I'm going to talk about some similarities and differences between these two times. And I'll talk about storytelling, decision-making, and then being a host. Also, so first, just a quick snapshot of our congregation, the Columbus Mennonite Church. We have about 175 folks on an average Sunday. We have 2 pastors, a church administrator, and several part-time support staff. And staff talking about this a lot and being on board has been really key for us. We are middle to slightly upper middle class, highly educated, mostly white. We own our own building, and we're located in a neighborhood pretty similar to the demographics of the congregation. And significantly, part of our church used to be a small apartment building, a quad, and it's now joined under one roof. The downstairs is used as offices and a bathroom, and the upstairs has been converted back to an apartment. We decided this building wants to be an apartment with a kitchenette and a full bathroom. Storytelling. In 2017, we celebrated the 55-year anniversary of the congregation. We had missed the 50 year, so we made a big deal out of 55. And when you have anniversaries, you have these stories of faithfulness, and we told one of the stories was being a part of the 1980s sanctuary movement that the church was involved with. This was mid-August when we had our anniversary Sunday, and it was 4 days later after that several of us met Edith Espinal for the first time, introduced to us through a local organizer who we knew well and had been working with. She'd been in the country for many years. She had 3 children facing deportation, and she was seeking sanctuary, and we had a week to decide, first of all, to learn what the heck sanctuary was, and then to decide if we could host her. And then January of 2025, that's very recent, during our worship service, we told the story of the original Zurich baptisms. I'm guessing we weren't alone here, the 500-year anniversary we just observed. And this act of faith and conscience, which was also a direct challenge to the political order of the day. So it was that same Sunday that we had a congregational meeting where we made the final decision to invite this new guest who requested sanctuary. And both, so I find it significant that both instances, serendipitously, we were in storytelling mode about who we were and who we've been and the decisions that we're making affecting who we might be. And I would say this absolutely impacted our conversations. People even brought up these stories in our decision-making process and the sense of that we're part of something. So I'm going to bring Leviticus in real quick to back me up here. Chapter 19, the same chapter that mentions love your neighbor as yourself, ends by saying love the immigrant as yourself. For you were immigrants in the land of Egypt. That last part. According to this teaching, you love the immigrant because of memory, because you correctly remember that that this is your story as well. So there's this direct relationship between memory, right remembering, and right action. And the right action for us has been hosting sanctuary. And it's a good year to tell stories for us Anabaptists. Secondly, decision making. In both cases, we have been blessed with a short timeline. There was a specific request from a person about sanctuary that we needed to respond to. And sometimes a crisis can help us along in our deliberations. Both times we had 2 congregational meetings, and these included some presentation, like talking about the history of the sanctuary movement and what's being asked of us, the legal implications, which we'll hear more about tonight, a bit of background about the women seeking sanctuary, some sharing from staff, as they would be the ones who would be in the building from throughout the day, most significantly impacted, and then open mic time for questions, concerns, clarifications. And each of those meetings lasted about 60 to 75 minutes. I do have one slide, if you could put it up now. We didn't have a clear precedent about how to decide this. We decided to have leadership team, our leadership team, make the decision with significant input from the congregation. And this 5-finger straw poll helped us out quite a bit. It added more nuance than just a yes or a no, a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And we, after the deliberations and the conversations, we had people do this not by raising hands, but on paper. We thought it was going to be harder for people to oppose it publicly because we felt like probably the majority were going to support it. So we wanted to give as much opportunity for people to just voice however they wanted to voice this on a paper ballot that we looked at. We treated it as a straw poll, not a vote. And our leadership team was empowered to make the decision. Fortunately, in both occasions, we had over 85% 4s and 5s, with mostly 5s, and we were able to just be transparent with the congregation about those results. But that's how we made the decision, and this helped us do that. Let's talk about hosting. So here's where I think some of the biggest differences are going to be. This relates to what Isaac said as well. The day Edith moved into sanctuary, Labor Day 2017, there was a press conference right outside the church. This was Edith's preference as well. So there were area clergy and activists, church members. Edith wore her shirt that said, "I am undocumented." And the philosophy was that, like coming out, that it's actually safer to come out. Because you humanize the situation and you gather a community of support around you, and that you're protected in the church, that ICE won't come in. And that's what happened. There were concerts in the building, connecting with others, calling senators, having elected officials visit Edith in the building, trying to change policy. It became a very public, a lot of public actions, including press. And this time feels really different because of there not being as much of a guarantee from ICE not entering the building. Our incoming guest feels, she initiated this conversation. She was also in sanctuary in the first administration, and she just says she feels safer in a church than her apartment. She is aware of the change. She's also aware of the change from ICE and the policy. You don't need to keep the slide up if that's I'm not going to talk about that anymore. But okay. We have let her know that we're not very good at keeping secrets. Like we're going to be, a church is not a good place to live secretly. I don't think, at least ours isn't. It's just a shared, she has a private room, but it's, this is a shared building. We tell stories to each other. I'm telling you this story right now. And she understands that. We, however, do not intend for this to be any kind of press event, which is quite different than last year. That feels like making us a target, making her a target. It feels like endangering her in a way that's really different. Not just ICE, but vigilantes, vandalism, or worse, feels like there's more emboldened this time around. She has an ICE check-in February at the end of this month that she's not going to go to, and we're still trying to figure out how to, like, a couple of us are probably going to go in her place, and we're not quite sure what we're going to say and whether we actually let them know she's in the church or not. That's something we're trying to discern. We do have a little bit of a relationship with the local ICE office, but I'm not, things just feel different this time around. We have a protocol for answering the door that we're working on. We understand we don't need to let ICE in the building unless they have a warrant signed by a federal judge. But we're going to talk with our staff about this and have a training and some role playing. The day-to-day life of Sanctuary really varies depending on the person and their circumstances. In this case, both of these individuals have partners who are living in the home apartment and are able to come and go, and so provide groceries. Our current guest, our incoming guest, has 2 teenage daughters who are going to keep attending their school. And so there's a team that's going to be helping with transportation. And last time, there were some people who stayed overnight initially, and then that ended up not being needed after a week or two. Edith felt comfortable by herself, and we're just kind of playing it by ear here. There's a lot to the day-to-day that if there's a group of churches that are doing this again, we'd probably glad to have a different conversation about those details. I'll just end by saying Sanctuary it's a very specific kind of commitment that you make to a person and to a household. And there's a fine balance between trying to give the person as much agency as possible and the reality of it just being a pretty restrictive and confining situation. So the value of storytelling, just to form us as our ethical, moral beings that we are, informed by story, and having good ways of making decisions that nuance a little more than just a thumbs up or thumbs down, and the recognition that it feels different this time around. But also, if there are people who want to enter Sanctuary and you have the facility and you have the community, it takes a wide community of support, partnerships. Like, it's possible. And we'll just have to we'll find our way through this, and appreciate the legal input that we're going to get real soon.
Thank you, Isaac and Rachel and Joel. I think that probably answered many of the questions that people had, just to hear that story, how the process for you all as you described it. So thank you for that. And just a reminder for participants, if you do have questions, we will hopefully have time and come to those at the end if you want to put them in the Q&A. And I will now turn it over to Iris.
Yeah, again, thank you, both Isaac and Rachel and Joel. Appreciate you sharing your stories. I think those are important for the church to hear. So thank you. Part 2 of this webinar, we've invited the Institute of Constitutional Advocacy and Protection out of Georgetown Law to kind of share where we are legally around sanctuary churches. Well, what does it mean? And after this presentation, Lorraine will facilitate as many questions as possible on the topic around sanctuary church. So right now, I'd like to introduce Kelsey Brown Corcoran and her colleague, Rupa Bhattacharya. Welcome. I'll turn it over to Kelsey or Rupa. I'm not sure which one.
Thanks very much. Rupa is going to lead the first part and I'll jump in. So I will defer to Rupa, but we're pleased to be here with you all and glad that there's so much interest. Oh, we can't hear you again, Rupa.
Nope, I'm up. Here we go. Terrific. Thank you all. We're so happy to be here. I'm going to try to share some slides, and then we will get started. Okay, can everyone see? Can we? Yes. Okay, great. So we wanted to talk today about some of the legal principles associated with sanctuary cities, sanctuary churches, and how those are and what the legal the legal framework is for you all to get a sense of what's going on. And we're going to talk about some of the things that Isaac and Rachel and Joel talked about in the context of the law and how the law has evolved over the course of the last 8 years since the last Trump administration was in place, and some of the places where the law continues to evolve. Just quickly, ICAP is a ICAP is an institute at Georgetown Law School. We are a nonpartisan group of lawyers that work using litigation, policy development, and constitutional scholarship to try to vindicate individual rights, protect democratic processes. I will crow for just a minute that we were part of the team that got a preliminary injunction today in Maryland in joining the executive order on birthright citizenship and putting a halt to that order for the time being while the court considers its legality. So we're very proud of that work, and we're very happy to be here talking to you all today. We so much appreciate your interest. So like I said, we're going to talk very briefly about the prohibition on harboring, which is a criminal statute found at 18 U.S. Code 1324, the application of that harboring provision to sanctuary churches, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which I will turn over to Kelsey to talk about, and then hopefully we can answer some of your questions. So starting with the federal law, this is the text of 18 U.S.C. 1324. That provision subjects to criminal punishment any person who, knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that an alien has come to, entered, or remains in the United States in violation of law, conceals, harbors, or shields from detection, or attempts to conceal, harbor, or shield from detection, such alien in any place, including any building or any means of transportation. I'm going to, just for a moment, I am going to beg all of your pardon on terminology. I am using the terms that are used in the law and in the cases. Those may not be the terms that we want to use or think are most appropriate, but I'm going to stick with what the law says. So we're gonna walk through each of these sort of highlighted pieces. What does knowing or reckless disregard mean? What does it mean to have to conceal, harbor, or shield from detection in the context of sanctuary churches? Before we do that, though, Section 1324, which is the harboring provision, also prohibits a number of other things that we're not going to talk about today, but I wanted to just flag them for you so you knew what they were. Section 1324 also prohibits bringing any alien into the United States other than at a designated port of entry. It prohibits transporting or moving aliens who are here in violation of the law anywhere within the United States. It prohibits encouraging or inducing an alien to come to, enter, or reside in the United States in violation of the law. And it criminalizes attempts or conspiracies to do any of these things. One of the most important things to remember about these provisions is that they apply to everyone. Some people think that these are really intended to prohibit smugglers or people who employ undocumented persons in sort of what we think of as traditional sweatshops, but that's not true. Those are covered by the statute, but as interpreted by the court, harboring can apply to any person who knowingly harbors an undocumented immigrant. This is a criminal statute. It is prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's offices. So it is a federal crime, which means it's prosecuted by federal authorities. There are penalties associated with violating it, including fines and imprisonment, which get worse if the conduct is done for purposes of financial gain or if the conduct results in serious bodily injury or death. Harboring convictions can also result in mandatory forfeiture of any property that was used to facilitate the crime under the basic standard forfeiture laws of the United States. So these are serious violations that can result in serious penalties, which is why we want to make sure people have some sense of what is covered. So we're going to talk very briefly about what the elements of harboring are. What does the government have to prove in order to make out a charge of harboring? So to establish a violation of this provision, the government has to prove at least the first three things on this screen: that the alien entered or remained in the United States in violation of law, that the defendant concealed, harbored, or sheltered that person within the United States, and that the defendant knew or recklessly disregarded the fact that the alien entered or remained in the United States in violation of the law. In some circuits, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second, you also have to show, the government also has to show that the defendant's conduct tended to substantially facilitate the alien remaining in the United States legally. A few jurisdictions don't use that last element because it's not in the text of the statute. You remember when we looked at the statute in one of the first slides, it doesn't include that language about substantial facilitation. That's something that we call a judicial gloss. It's the way courts have interpreted the statute to give it more meaning. And we'll talk about what the jurisdictions have done. Very quickly, this is a map of the United States giving the geographic boundaries of the federal courts of appeals. There are 11 geographic courts of appeals that cover these various colored areas, plus the DC Circuit, which covers the District of Columbia, the Federal Circuit, which has nothing to do with any of this, and of course the Supreme Court of the United States, which is the highest authority in the U.S. when it comes to judicial opinions.
So it
Kelsey,
would be
do you wanna-
helpful right now, as you're looking at this map, to write down the number that applies to where you live, and then you'll be able to reference that in what Rupa says next.
I'll give you just a second to figure that out. And in case it's not clear, Puerto Rico is in the First Circuit based on that color combination. Okay, so part of the reason this area of the law is so confusing and requires a lot of thought is that there is no definitive definition of harboring. The Supreme Court has never addressed this particular provision of 1324 in terms of what exactly it means. It has addressed other provisions of 1324, but not this one. And so the courts of appeals in various parts of the country have adopted different tests. And so the rules can vary depending upon which jurisdiction you are in. And I guess I'm going to stop here for just a second to say that we are not, in the course of this presentation, trying to offer legal advice. We really do encourage you, if you are considering a sanctuary program, to talk to immigration lawyers who have experience with what the law is in your circuit, because it does vary. The tests that are listed here, and I'm just going to read them briefly, for purposes of the translators, because we did not provide the slides in Spanish, include conduct that substantially facilitates remaining in the US and that prevents authorities from detecting the individual's unlawful presence. That's the law in the Second Circuit, which includes New York and several of the other Northeastern states. Affirmative conduct, such as providing shelter, transportation, direction about obtaining false documents, or warnings about impending investigations that facilitates continuing illegal presence. That's the Third Circuit's test in Pennsylvania and other states. Conduct tending to substantially facilitate an immigrant's remaining in the US illegally. That is the Fifth Circuit's test. Which is Texas and Louisiana and a couple of other states down there. Conduct that clandestinely shelters, succors, and protects improperly admitted immigrants. That's the test in the Sixth Circuit, which includes Tennessee, Michigan, and Ohio. Conduct that provides or offers a known undocumented individual a secure haven, a refuge, or a place to stay in which authorities are unlikely to seek him, which is the test in the Seventh Circuit in Illinois and several other sort of states up there. And conduct that offers shelters to undocumented individuals, which is a test in the Ninth Circuit. These tests generally break down into two categories. There's a group of states that have a rule that substantial facilitation of an immigrant's remaining in the US illegally is enough to constitute harboring. There's another group of states that also require some affirmative element of concealment or attempt to avoid detection by the government. So there's the broader test, which is substantial facilitation alone, or there's the narrower test that that includes that concealment element or attempt to avoid detection.
I mean, just to say, Joel talked about what they were doing in Ohio, and you can see Ohio falls in the Sixth Circuit, and the Sixth Circuit has that concealing requirement. So one thing that Joel's congregation was doing by being very public about it was, I don't know if this is why, protecting yourself from the criminal harboring, because within your circuit, the fact that you were open about it meant that you weren't violating. Just as an example.
Yeah, although in the circuits that don't have that element, that can play the other way, which we'll talk about when we get to the knowing or reckless disregard part of the standard. So we'll come back to that in a second. Harboring prosecutions are, there have been a lot of them over the years. They have covered things such as providing housing at cost, transporting people to and from work, arranging for sham marriages to allow for, to try to obtain US citizenship, employing undocumented workers and encouraging them to obtain false paperwork, providing shelter, transportation, direction about how to obtain false documents or warnings about impending investigations, or instructing, for example, undocumented workers to act like customers when leaving a job site. In that case, it was a restaurant, in order to avoid detection by ICE agents who were waiting outside. Conduct that instructs undocumented immigrants how to avoid arrest and detection by immigration authorities is probably going to fall within the ambit of harboring. So you do need to be very careful about what sort of advice you provide people about how to avoid detection. Now, the sort of ICE Watch programs that Joel talked about, or Isaac, I'm sorry, I don't remember which one, Isaac talked about, are are very close to the line, I think. And so that is something on which I might want to seek some advice from an immigration lawyer in your area. I don't think a general program crosses the line, but if you are actually affirmatively telling individual people that ICE is on their way with a warrant, that could cause, and advising them to hide themselves, that could cause issues, particularly in a new and much more aggressive administration that is aggressively enforcing this law. Turning to the knowing or reckless disregard requirement of the law, the statute requires that you do the harboring activity either in knowing or reckless disregard of the fact that the alien is here in violation of the laws of the United States. Knowing means that you have direct knowledge that the person entered or remained in violation of the law. Reckless disregard means that you were deliberately indifferent or willfully ignorant of facts which would indicate a high probability that the person entered or remained in violation of the law. And either one can be shown by direct or by circumstantial evidence. So in those states where substantial facilitation alone without any element of concealment is the test, broadcasting the intent to shelter an undocumented migrant from immigration enforcement and saying that you will attempt to prevent ICE from taking them into custody, for example, because you don't think that undocumented persons should be deported or something like that, could mean that you are showing reckless disregard for the law, right? Because you are admitting in public that you know what the law is, that you are affirmatively opposed to it, that you have taken someone into sanctuary for the purpose of avoiding ICE detention. Now, I don't think that that's going to be true in circuits like Joel's that require, as Kelsey said earlier, that require some form of concealment. But in the circuits that don't have that element, I do worry that that becomes, that meets this particular part of the test. Criminal statutes also usually require some form of intent. Proof of intent to break the law, either purposefully, so doing something for the purpose of getting to that consequence, knowingly, doing something knowing that the consequence will come about, or recklessly, doing it without care for a foreseeable consequence. The language of the harboring statute does not contain an express intent requirement about the harborer breaking the law. It does contain, as we just talked about, an express knowledge requirement about what the person, about the status of the person being harbored, if you get the distinction there. So there's been a debate in the courts about what level of intent is required in order to actually allow for criminal liability. Some courts have held that there must be a specific intent to violate immigration laws. Other courts have held that there must be a specific intent to do an illegal act, which may or may not be a violation of the immigration laws. And there are a few courts that have said that this statute has no specific intent requirement. Based on cases in the Supreme Court in the past, including just a few terms ago, I think it's highly unlikely that the court would uphold a no specific intent requirement with respect to a criminal statute. The Supreme Court has generally required that there be some sort of criminal mental state proved before prosecuting a crime. It's a concept that they reaffirmed just a few years ago in a case involving a criminal stalking law. So I don't think that one will survive, but it is the law in a few states, at least for now. So to be aware of that. So what are the limits of these laws? What can you do? What sorts of things have courts not found to be harboring? Well, so far, just employing undocumented persons without more has not been found to be harboring. In all of the cases where an employment of an undocumented person was determined to be harboring, there was something else going on. Usually there were false papers that were being provided by the employer. In some cases, they provided false background information for security purposes. So there was something more than just the sheer employment of the person. Simply sheltering or cohabitating with an undocumented person without more has generally not been found to be harboring. In most of the cases, again, something more was going on. They were being charged rent was one thing that comes up in a number of cases. Again, providing transportation to and from employment, for example, can come up in cases. False documents has come up in cases. Helping undocumented persons seek lawful status has never been found to constitute harboring. And in fact, there's not very many cases that deal with immigration-related services at all. And then providing services or humanitarian assistance to undocumented persons without more has not been found to be harboring. The best case for this was a case out of, I think, Arizona, possibly Texas. I don't remember. I'm sorry, where a humanitarian organization left food and water in the desert for migrants that were crossing the border so that they had humanitarian assistance when they came across the border illegally. That conduct was found not to be harboring in the circumstances of that particular case. All of these things are a little bit at risk if the administration, if the federal government that is prosecuting these cases is going to take a very aggressive view of the statute. Under some of the tests that we looked at, if the only test, for example, is substantial facilitation of a person's ability to remain in the United States, providing services, ESL services, for example, ESL training, may meet that standard under just a very, very strict and aggressive interpretation of the law. And we just don't have a good way to know right now where those sorts of cases might go or where they might be brought. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Kelsey to talk about one of the tools that churches have in their quiver, which is different from some of the other kinds of humanitarian organizations or others who may be looking at harboring issues themselves, and that's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
Thanks, Rupa. So that was all probably a little scary. I'm going to say something a little bit more hopeful. It won't eliminate the risk. But what we're going to talk about now is the possibility that RFRA, the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act, provides a defense to criminal prosecution for people of faith who are offering sanctuary as part of their religious practice. So what the Religious Freedom so as this slide says, sanctuary is not a legal concept in modern US law. And in fact, there were, I think, a number of prosecutions in the 80s against churches that provided sanctuary. Isaac notes the Scott Warren case, which was a famous one. It's not recognized as a bar to law enforcement. However, those cases I just mentioned were before the enactment of RFRA in the early 90s. So the Supreme Court held in a case called Smith v. Employment Division Services that the religious exercise clause of the First Amendment doesn't provide protection for people in exercising their religious beliefs if the law itself is generally applicable. So the harboring law we just talked about is generally applicable. It's not targeted at people of faith. And so under that case, Smith, the First Amendment does not protect churches from prosecution. After that case, the Supreme Court, or sorry, that's Congress responded by enacting RFRA. RFRA is intended to provide the protection to religious people that the First Amendment did not under Smith. And so what RFRA says is that the federal government may not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion unless such burden is in furtherance of a compelling government interest and is the least restrictive means of meeting that compelling government interest. And so think of RFRA as a super statute that lays on top of all other federal statutes. So RFRA constrains the ability of the government to apply the harboring provision in a situation where it would substantially burden religious exercise in a way that was not in furtherance of a compelling government interest or was not the least restrictive means of doing that. Okay, next slide. So what does it mean to substantially burden religious practice? It means that the government is putting substantial pressure on a person to modify their behavior and violate their religious beliefs. It has to be above an inconvenience, and it has to fall on the religious adherent. So to kind of think about the difference, one example of a case where the court rejected a RFRA claim was a religious group that wanted to sell T-shirts in a public place, and the zoning laws didn't allow it. And that group said, well, we need to sell the T-shirts to raise money for our group. The RFRA claim was rejected. The most famous RFRA case is probably the Hobby Lobby decision from the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said that the families that own Hobby Lobby, a large chain of stores, had a religious right not to provide contraceptive health care coverage to their employees, even though that was required by federal law. Okay, so how do you show a substantial burden? Show that you've been forced to do something that your religion forbids, that you've been prevented from engaging in conduct your religion requires, and forcing you to choose between following your religion and having forfeiting benefits or having the negative consequence. So we can go to the next slide. So how would this look if Sanctuary Church, any of your churches were to provide sanctuary and then were to be criminally prosecuted? The first thing you would have to show is the sincerity of your religious belief. Courts do not probe very much what is a sincere belief, and the religious mandate to welcome and care for the stranger in both Judeo-Jewish and Christian traditions is so explicit and repeated and unequivocal. I can't imagine a circumstance where you wouldn't be able to say that as Mennonites, you have a sincere religious mandate to serve and welcome immigrants. Okay, the next slide. So I think also the substantial burden piece of being criminally prosecuted, right? You're having to choose between fulfilling this religious mandate or being criminally prosecuted, I think I would say is substantially burdensome, but we don't have a lot of, this is kind of a new area. I will say the Scott Warren case, that was, I believe he was providing water, food, assistance to people who were crossing the desert, and he was criminally prosecuted. Isaac can correct me if I'm wrong about that. He offered a defense of RFRA that was rejected by the district court, and then he was acquitted at trial. So the case never went up to the higher court. So there really is no kind of useful metric to know on whether there's a RFRA defense to sanctuary. Compelling interest. So you've shown your sincerely held religious belief. Now the government, you have to show the government didn't have a compelling interest, or the burden's actually on the government. it is probably the case that enforcing immigration laws is a compelling interest, right? We have quotes here showing that inherent in national sovereignty, protecting the country from foreign encroachments. That's the argument that will be made there. Next slide. But is this the least restrictive means? I'm going to pause here and talk a little bit about the sensitive locations policy. I know we have it on a different slide, but I think it helps parse out kind of, or maybe, do we have this on the next slide, Rupa? Am I jumping in? Okay. So ICE has statutory authority to conduct, I would say, warrantless arrests and raids in the immigration context. I say warrantless because they can do that without a judicial warrant. They will give themselves something called an administrative warrant, where they write their own note giving themselves authority to go conduct the arrest. And so this is much more expansive than criminal law enforcement would normally have to do criminal arrests, where you would have to have a judicial warrant to go into private places, or you would have to have a basis for the arrest. This expands the authority of ICE. But for 30 years, until 3 weeks ago, the government, the Department of Homeland Security, had a sensitive locations policy in which they would not go into sensitive locations, churches, schools, hospitals, places where there would be a significant cost to an undocumented person to not be able to go there, to be educated, to worship, to have to receive healthcare. That they would not go into those places without a judicial warrant or exigent circumstances. That means some emergency, someone dangerous runs into a church, and so the officers need to run behind that person. Or if they had supervisory authority from someone higher up in DHS. So it was not true when Joel and Isaac and Rachel were doing sanctuary that there was no way to get the folks that they were providing sanctuary to. If ICE had gotten a judicial warrant, it could have entered any of their churches and removed the person. What the sanctuary did was just make it a little bit harder. And in fact, even under the sensitive locations policy, or there's a difference between, I think we do have a slide on this, the private area, so the apartment space would not be open to ICE. That would be like a home, and then you've got the public spaces, right? The sanctuary, any kind of opening lobby you have. So it wasn't that sanctuary was this bulletproof way of protecting people before. 3 weeks ago, the Department of Homeland Security announced that it would no longer follow the sensitive locations policy. And what that means is it will no longer, it does not perceive itself as needing a judicial warrant to go into the public spaces of churches. And this varies from church to church. I think we do have a slide on that. Should we go to the next one?
Actually, I don't think I put it on the slide, but so
We
we
didn't
can
have it
talk
there. Okay.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I don't want to get too far ahead of us, like kind of get into a different subject, but I'm sure you all have been thinking about this because it's actually not just about sanctuary. You might have undocumented congregants. You might have undocumented people who are coming to your soup kitchen or your English classes, right? There are all sorts of reasons undocumented people might be in your church other than sanctuary. And now there is this risk of ICE coming in and conducting raids. And we know that happened in a church in Georgia the first Sunday after the policy was rescinded. So some churches, what they're doing is attempting to make all of their church private by putting signs on the door that say, ICE may not enter, this is a private space. This is all new territory. I can't tell you what will work or what won't work. I can say that if ICE has a judicial warrant, they do have a right to go in regardless of what signs you have. So what the signs are potentially doing is keeping ICE out if it's an administrative warrant, one of the warrants they write themselves. I think Joel maybe talked about this a little earlier. So still a lot of unknown there. And I think the other question, and we don't have answers to it, is if you're doing sanctuary, or even if you just have undocumented congregants or people in your building and ICE comes and you don't let them in, are you potentially running afoul of 1324 when you do that? And I think it's I don't know, Rupa, if you want to weigh in on that. I think if it's a judicial warrant, and you're not letting ICE in, you could be running into problems under 1324. I think that if ICE just shows up and doesn't have a judicial warrant, you could make a RFRA claim that they are not, that they are substantially burdening your religion by attempting to come in. They may have a compelling interest in enforcing the immigration laws, but attempting to enforce it without a judicial warrant is not the least restrictive means of doing that. Again, Rupa and I are not your lawyers. We are not telling you that any of these defenses will work, but these are the sorts of arguments that lawyers might make if that were to happen. I think the bottom line is that there is no way to avoid risk of criminal liability here. There just isn't. We wish we could give you a list of things you could do in order to be able to serve people in this way and also avoid liability, but that doesn't exist.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what Kelsey said is that attempting to block ICE from executing a judicial warrant, right? A warrant that has actually been signed by a judge upon a finding of probable cause, by a neutral magistrate upon a finding of probable cause, is not only harboring, it's probably also just straight up obstruction. And so judicial warrants are going to mean something. I think Kelsey is right that there is an argument that an administrative warrant is not the least restrictive means by which to come into a church where there is either a sanctuary policy or their coming in would result in disruption of a religious function or religious service or impose some other form of substantial burden on religious activities. The only other thing, we've got a couple of additional resources here, and we will provide a PDF version of these slides with the links so that you can reference these materials if you want to. I added a couple of things here just that have good understandings of the law. Most of these are pretty old because there is a lot of evolving law, and of course because ICE had up till this time not enforced in churches, there's not a lot of new information about how exactly the law will apply. But I did find some of these useful. The ACLU document in particular, I will flag only because it includes a list of things that congregations could do beyond sanctuary that probably would not run afoul of harboring statutes. That might be worth a look if you're trying to figure out how to meet your religious obligations and your religious goals with respect to your immigrant populations. The Justice Department memo was written pre-RFRA, so it does not account for the new federal statute, but it has a good description of the history of sanctuary law and how it is not part of the law of the United States. So I thought it might be helpful. And with that, I think Lorraine or Iris, we will turn it over for questions.
Thank you so much, Kelsey and Rupa. That was a lot of information. I feel like this is one of those webinars that all of us might have to go back and rewatch, just given all that you've provided. So thank you so much. I know as I've been watching the questions that have come in, that some of them are very much connected or asking questions about specific districts that you mentioned. And so I'm not sure, partly what I heard from you is, you're not attorneys for everyone. on this webinar. And so people need to contact their local immigration attorneys. Is that clear? I just want to say that to make it clear if that's the case. Is that right?
Yes, and I think at least one of the questions asked about a circuit that wasn't on our list. And that there are some circuits that just haven't addressed the issue at all, right? Was the 10th Circuit on our list, Rupa?
No, the 10th Circuit was not on our list. It's not it doesn't include, well, I guess New Mexico is a border state. Some of the circuits just don't have huge populations, so there hasn't been a lot of prosecution. The 8th is one of those. So, but yeah, if it's not on the list, there may be some law there, and we can try to track it down for you if you're particularly interested in a particular circuit. The ones that I listed were sort of a representative sample of what the circuits have held.
One of the questions asked about, and this also came in earlier, about, I know the ACLU has circulated the Know Your Rights cards and red cards. Is that, how do people, I mean, is that something people should use? Is that something people should have?
I have to say that I've not looked at the current versions of the red cards. I've seen them previously, but I don't know that I've looked at them recently. But there are any number of organizations that are providing Know Your Rights resources. The ACLU is one of them, and generally their stuff is pretty good.
Okay. One of the other questions that I had that came up for me when you were talking about the different regarding clandestine language, that would have been in effect for Joel in Ohio in that district. And so I wanted to just ask, Joel, is that something that you considered when you were as a sanctuary church, that you looked at that before you made the decision, well, we're going to go public because then this can't be used against us? I'm wondering for churches how much, and Isaac and Rachel, maybe you can talk about that as well. How much did you look at what was happening in your district to make those decisions that you made?
For us, we were aware of that federal code with harboring, but we actually weren't aware of the distinction with District 6, which we're in, of the concealment. I'm glad to hear that. And I don't think that would have affected what happened last time. There were a lot of people going public with sanctuary last time, but thank you for that additional information.
Someone was also just asking, how do you tell the difference between an administrative and a judicial warrant? Is that going to just be written on there, so you ask to see the warrant and look for that specific word, or what do you look for?
So a judicial warrant will have listed at the very top of the document, the United States District Court for the District of, and it will be signed by a federal judge. An administrative warrant will have neither of those things. I will try to find a link to put in the chat that shows a description, that shows what one of them looks like. They do vary a little bit from court to court, so they're not all going to look exactly the same. But a federal warrant will look something like this. Here, I'm going to put this one in the chat. I will put one in the chat.
Thank you.
You could also ask, do you have a judicial warrant, right? When the ICE shows up at the door.
Mm-hmm. Another question was, Rupa, one person was asking, was Rupa saying that the Trump administration could determine that just teaching ESL could expose an individual or a college or church to prosecution for harboring?
So it's going to require more than that, right? Like, it's not just teaching ASL. It would be If they do so knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that the persons that they are teaching are here illegally. And so if you offer general services to immigrant populations without without regard for their immigration status, that may not meet that standard. In most circuits, you're also going to have some specific intent to violate the law, that you are, by doing this activity, intending to substantially facilitate their staying here illegally. That may also be a standard that can't be met in those circumstances. But I worry about how aggressive this administration might be in these circumstances.
Yes, I was going to just, there's the question of what this current administration will attempt to prosecute and what a court would actually find violative of the statute. And I don't think Rupa or anyone I can answer what this administration is going to criminally prosecute based on what we've seen these last 3 weeks. They could, we just have no idea. They don't seem to feel especially constrained by legal norms or laws. You could take some comfort, though, that our judicial system, at least right now, still seems to be working. And so if if you were to be prosecuted for teaching ESL, I think Rupa's answer is, this is why a court, we think, probably would not find that you had engaged in a crime, but we can't know. We don't know what judge you would get. It could be a judge who is appointed by this administration, right? There are a lot of unknowns, but I would distinguish between what they might do, which we can't take anything off the table, and what would ultimately be successful in court.
But the other piece to this is the safe location piece. So like if you're teaching English as a second language and you know that at your church and there's immigrants there, that's where ICE could come in, right? I mean, it's not safe then. It's not so much a prosecution to people teaching, but it's that you have now a group of people that are vulnerable, and ICE knows that they're there and could come in.
Yes, that is 100% true. And I was talking about the sensitive locations policy in connection with potential criminal prosecution. But even if you put harboring to the side, churches are just very vulnerable. I saw a question about locking the door. So the church in Georgia had the door locked. ICE showed up. They were looking for a specific person. According to his wife, I believe he was an asylum seeker who had been allowed to be public, but he was wearing maybe some sort of ankle monitor or wrist monitor. It was the middle of worship services. The pastor was preaching. There was the knock on the door. I don't know if it was a pastor. Someone answered and did not allow ICE in. The worship service ended. The man and his family left, and he was promptly arrested at that point. Another, to Iris's point about English classes, if I'm picturing my church, we would probably teach English like up on the second floor in the auxiliary classrooms that maybe you would say are not open to the public in the same way that the sanctuary or fellowship hall might be, right? So there might be things you can do to move people out of the spaces that would be considered public. And potentially locking your door is a way of communicating that you don't consider any of your church public. We've heard about schools doing that as well. But I know a lot of churches are struggling with this because part of the religious mission is to be open and welcoming. And so to lock the doors feels like an unconscionable choice as well, which gets us right back to RFRA, right? If you're having to choose between making your congregants and visitors vulnerable to arrest, and on the other hand, not being able to fulfill your religious obligation to be welcoming, that is not a fair choice for the federal government to be making people or imposing on people.
There's also the question of when you talk about harboring and that criminal statute, who does that include? So a church has made this decision. Is all members responsible? Who is ultimately responsible when that happens, if there's going to be a criminal sanction?
so that's a really good question. And I'm not sure that we have a great answer. Because I think it's going to depend. Again, those intentionality standards, the knowing and reckless disregard, and whatever the specific intent requirement is, are going to limit the people that can be held responsible. Most likely, it's going to be decision makers who have that sort of authority. Now, where you have a whole congregation voting on a policy, I'm not quite sure how that would work. These are all reasons why the federal government may refrain from trying to bring these sorts of prosecutions. They will hit up against very hard questions that will have to be answered, and courts are going to be somewhat unwilling to delve into the minutia of church organization, right, or church structure. But it is hard to know. I don't know, Kelsey, if you have a better response than that.
I think that's right. And the other thing, we're looking, I don't know if there's silver linings, but just to make people feel a little less scared, to remember that, we tend to think of Democratic appointed judges and Republican appointed judges as having different kind of inclinations in cases. What we're talking about falls in this space where you can imagine that the kind of typical Democratic appointed judge is going to be really concerned about the implications for immigrants, and then you have Republican appointed judges who are maybe more concerned about religious liberty issues. What we're talking about is at the intersection of those two things. And so when Rupa says a court's probably not going to want to delve into kind of internal church organization, I think too, it's always you don't know what judge you're going to get, what panel you'll get on the Court of Appeals. But this strikes me as a sort of thing where we can be hopeful, maybe not optimistic, but hopeful that courts will restrain any sort of excessive law enforcement efforts by the administration.
I'm just paying attention to our time, and I want, if there are any of you who just feel like there are some final thoughts that you have in response to any, particularly the questions that you feel like you want to respond to, or just any final thoughts. And so maybe I'll just start. So with Isaac and Rachel and Joel, are there any final words? And then Kelsey and Rupa maybe to end. Nothing you all want, you're good. Okay.
Just one final word. I have taken a lot of comfort, hope in the prayer that's now included in our hymnal that came from Columbus Mennonite, that Joel's a part of during their sanctuary as a prayer that you all developed with your witness for Edith. Is that right, Joel? If you could share maybe what number that is too. It's just an absolutely beautiful prayer that I think is helpful Christian work of centering our lives of what it means to be a sanctuary people.
Yeah, give me like 5 seconds.
You got it. Thank you. Rachel, anything you want to add?
I would say that as you're considering what to do next, spend time in prayer with one another, listen to the Holy Spirit, and be ready to do as the Spirit calls.
It's 10:42 in the hymnal, and in our congregation we printed out little stickers that said 12:35, and we stuck it next to 10:42 because that's how many days Edith was in sanctuary. And it's written in English and Spanish, and I'll read the English. God, our sanctuary, grant us and our neighbors near and far courage in our hearts, peace in our homes, and justice in our streets. And that came out of a member suggesting that we have a prayer together each Sunday that we would share together and then share more widely if requested. Then it was
Thank you.
translated into Spanish.
Thanks, Joel. Kelsey or Rupa, any final words?
That was a beautiful way to end. I don't know. Rupa, do you have anything else?
No, I just I want to thank all of you for the good works that you do, for the prayers that you give, and I hope that this has not been too disheartening for you, and that it has instead provided some helpful information so that you can continue to do your work. Thank you so much.
Well, I just want to say thank you. Thank you all for joining and taking this time. I think information, even when it feels overwhelming, is information that we need, rather than what we imagine it could be. So thank you for helping us just kind of sort that for ourselves. Iris, anything you want to add?
No, just thankful for all the people that participated and your time. We really appreciate it.
I also want to, just as a reminder, that for those part of the webinar for latest news and events from MCUSA, be sure to subscribe to Piecemeal, our weekly e-newsletter. I think that link has been put in the chat. Also wanted to let you know that on February 12th from 2 to 3 Eastern time, there will also be, MCC will be hosting a webinar, Invitation to Hospitality and Solidarity with Immigrant Communities. So I think that link is either in the chat or will be, so feel free to sign up for that as well. But again, wanting to thank all of you for joining us, both as panelists and as participants, and wish you well. Bless
Hey,
you.
Lorraine, I have one more question, or maybe
Yes.
this is for Iris. Does Mennonite Church USA have any kind of formal relationship now with Kelsey and Rupa as far as ongoing legal advice?
Not with respect to anything that we've talked about today. Certainly if someone ends up getting criminally prosecuted, you could reach out. Rupa and I are not criminal defense lawyers, which is one of the reasons we're not giving you legal advice right now. I believe there will be lawyers who do that work, who will stand up to represent people in these circumstances. And certainly reaching out to us, we could help facilitate finding lawyers for that, if it were to come to that.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. Thanks.
Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day, or as you head to bed.